Okay, so I also want to bring our attention to an aspect of war literature, which is the representation of race and ethnicity. So some of the texts that we'll be studying deal with or represent some of the conflicts related to racial inequalities or discrimination, issues of prejudice. Um, and if we think about some of the rhetoric of war, so the language that's used in sort of political language, in speeches and whatnot, there's always, in times of war, a kind of us versus them ideology or mentality. And this us versus them, right? Us in the West, we see ourselves as the good side and as doing the right thing, as having a moral high ground. And then whoever is placed on the other side, the enemy, they're viewed as the opposite of us, right? So if we're good, they're evil. If we're morally right, they are morally wrong. Um, so there is this sort of opposition created, a duality, very binary division, and some of the text will start disrupting this very simplified vision of war. In reality, each side would have their own interpretation of who is right and who is wrong, or who is good and who is evil, right? So depending on who is writing the story, whose perspective that war narrative is from, of course, you would have a different take on this good versus evil, us versus them position. So if we took, um, a narrative of war and then wrote it from the enemy's perspective, it would be completely different, right? They would view themselves as the sympathetic, uh, heroic side. So it's all based on, perceptions, ideologies, and language. So in these two examples of war propaganda, we have, these would be political posters, propaganda that be used to inspire and um, encourage civilians to support the war efforts. They use imagery that is sort of depicting the enemy, the other, as unhuman, as brutal, as monstrous, um, sexually depraved. Uh, you know, in both instances here, we have women as the target, right? So women are like the property or the what we fear and what we have to defend as soldiers, women and children, from this terrifying, monstrous enemy. And often the portrayals in propaganda dehumanize the enemy, right? So they're depicted as like animals or like monsters, subhuman. They're no longer even a man or a human. They are something different, right? They're animalistic, brutal savages. So we have this use of propaganda as kind of a tool of political uh, messages. And race and ethnicity is part of that, right? So in a war, there's always this kind of patriotic pride in your own country, in your own nation. You want to serve your country and you believe in it, in its greatness. And that can be like, that's not a bad thing to have some patriotism, to, be proud to be from Canada. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think there's sort of, when taken to an extreme, when you think your country or your nation is, superior to another, that's when you get into the lines of ethnocentrism, of, expanding military occupations and sort of a more aggressive stance towards other nations. when you get into this idea of superior versus inferior, that's when you're definitely sort of treading in territory of racism and other types of sort of discrimination that exist, where we have one group of people being dehumanized or viewed as inferior. So in the texts that we'll study, some of them have been written are from the perspective of sort of white men. Some are from perspectives of men of color or men of ethnic diversity. The perspectives are also sort of can be interpreted as a kind of in relation to masculinity and the sort of hegemonic male. So let's take a look at that aspect of this. So in regard to race and gender, there are sort of these intersections that occur between these two areas. And if we think about what our definition of hegemonic or dominant masculinity, in the Western world, we think of, whiteness, Caucasian, the white male as being sort of the hegemonic presentation of masculinity. But if you were in another nation or group, the hegemonic form of masculinity might reflect whoever has power or privilege in that situation or community. And then the marginalized or subordinate forms of masculinity in the West include men of color or men of sort of non-Anglo-Saxon ethnicity. For example, a Jewish man would fall into that category. So there is a sort of range of power and privilege based on your intersections of race and gender. So you might still be a man in a patriarchal society, but maybe your race or your nationality or your ethnicity prohibits you or is a obstacle to you gaining the highest levels of power and privilege in that society. So there are these intersections that also exist. You could include class structures as well. So if you come from a working class background or grew up in poverty, these are other sort of barriers to power and privilege in especially in Western culture specifically. So the texts that we'll study we can look for evidence of racial discrimination or racial inequalities, the treatment of any marginalized men and women who are outside of that hegemonic bubble, and whether or not the text presents whiteness as the hegemonic form of masculinity, or if there is a sort of competing or different representation of hegemonic masculinity. So this is something we can pay attention to as well. So in war literature, war rhetoric, there has been a kind of racist ideology in regards to representations of what we call the other and the enemy, I guess, in some cases, where you would have them represented as dehumanized. Sometimes they're feminized, but they're stereotypically portrayed in ways that diminish their personhood. So they're not depicted as fully formed humans, as individuals, as subjects. They're often just characterized as the evil others who are immoral, barbaric, and, completely uncivilized or something like that, right? So that's what you find in the war propaganda that sort of depicts the enemy as something less than. Even the word, even political rhetoric now will use the word evil in war. So George Bush talked about the axis of evil. Something like that would be a piece of war rhetoric, like a piece of language that's used to sort of influence and persuade his audience to support the war effort. So even, depictions of or the treatment of others as less than human, as dehumanized, this is sort of part what we can look for in the text. So how the other is being represented. And there's always going to be the other, right? So whenever you have a subject, you always have somebody who is a contrast to that person. So if we think about it in gender terms, if you have a man, he's always sort of in contrast with a woman. So the same thing could go in terms of sort of race or ethnicity, where we have a kind of colonial position and then the colonized subject. So we can, if you had like a very traditional war literature, that it might sort of present the war hero as, as being very macho, masculine, morally righteous, and logical, and all these good traits, and then the bad guys are viewed as or depicted as kind of irrational, barbaric, subhuman, sinful, corrupt, all these things like that. So there's always some bias in a representation of when you pit two sides against the other. So we can look for that as well. So in war language or war ideology, military ideology, there is this projection or perception that the enemy is other, is different than our side. So there is this kind of self versus other, or the self same versus the other, who embodies all that our side is not supposed to be. So this other, this is a term I guess we could use in our discussions. So the other is the enemy, the unknown or mysterious person or persons who are on the other side of this conflict. The other is also very threatening, and we don't understand them completely. There's still a mystery to us, so they are perceived as a threat, and they're perceived as different, and they're perceived as embodying everything that I say that I'm not, or that I'm not, or not supposed to be. So if I'm supposed to be morally righteous, morally superior, they are the opposite of that. So I project or perceive that the other is immoral, corrupt, evil. And this is kind of what war sort of boils down to, is this kind of conflict between one side and the other. And depending on which side you're on, you're always going to view the enemy as different, a threat, and something about them is, unknowable, but they represent or embody things you're supposed to hate, things you're not supposed to value in your culture or in your society. So again, it's largely based on ideology. So it's just a system or perception or worldview that's constructed, and we can look for evidence of this sort of binary opposition in the text that we read as well. So who is the other in the text, who's the enemy or perceived threat.